Hey, Larken Rose here. There's a lot more to the mental manipulation and subjugation of humanity than even a lot of pro-freedom people tend to think about. You see a little bit of it in the Jones Plantation movie, and there's even more about it in the novel version of the Jones Plantation, where Smith actually has some discussions with Mr. Johnson, and at one point he basically says, because Johnson is basically saying, like, you almost sound like it's magic the way you control what these people think and what they want. And Smith basically says, well, there's a fine line between persuasion and black magic, because you can achieve a lot if you know certain tricks and the other person doesn't even know what happened to them. Anybody familiar with NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, is aware of some very creepy ways in which the way we're wired makes us susceptible to manipulations that sometimes just like a gesture and a phrase and a movement and a touch and like little things can hugely impact how we feel and how we respond to somebody else. And if we don't make it a point to like keep hold of our rational mind and our skeptical thinking when dealing with other people, human beings are kind of easy to hack most of the time, and to deceive and manipulate, and to thereby be controlled by psychopaths. And so I thought I'd do a video about one kind that comes up in the language we use, and not even just the language that the control freaks use, but the language normal people use. And one example, it actually came up in a comment under a video I made about cops who like think they're in the right. And I forget even the whole comment, but somebody basically brought up the thing of when cops or bureaucrats or tax collectors say like, well, I don't have a choice. I have to enforce the law. And if what they mean is, if I didn't do this, I'm going to get fired and not have a paycheck. Okay, but that's not quite the same thing as I don't have a choice. Yeah, you do have a choice. It's like a carjacker saying, well, I'm broke and I don't have any money. I don't have a choice. I have to steal your car. The difference is carjackers won't usually say that because they realize, well, I don't have to. I'm just going to because I benefit. So there's this weird you have to thing that a lot of people talk that way when it comes to commands of authority. Like, you don't have a choice. You have to. And the flip side of that is, you're not allowed to, blah, 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 blah. Or even, you can't. Like, you can't do that in this state. Like, over in that state, you're allowed to, like, have marijuana or something. But you can't have that here. And what does that imply? It's a real, if you think of the actual language, it's really bizarre. Because, of course, what it is implying is, if you have that here and, enforcers of the law catch you, they might drag you away and put you in a cage. Which is, kind of a big, long, complicated thing to say. And you can't do that here is sort of a briefer way to say it. But there's something else to the connotation. Because if somebody is like, oh, let's go for a walk. Hey, let's walk down this back alley. And you're like, yeah, this is a dangerous part of town, and like the gangs hang out here, and walking down one of these alleys may very well get you mugged or killed. So yeah, don't do that. Usually we'll talk in terms of the consequences. Like we'll say that's dangerous, or if you do that, you'll probably get mugged or murdered or something. We don't usually say, if somebody goes, oh, let's go this way, you can't do that. You're not allowed to. It's like, well, what does that mean? Well, if it means something bad will happen to you if you do, then say that, like we would in almost any other context. It's like, oh, if this is dangerous, don't do that. Now, to say you can't do that without, like, endangering yourself, that actually means something. That's a complete thought. But nobody would say you're not allowed to. Like, let's walk down this way instead of that. You're not allowed to, and by that I mean there are violent gangs in the area who might, like, well, what do you mean you're not allowed to? What a weird way to say it. But when it comes to the command of the ruling class, people talk that way. You're not allowed to do this over here. Or even, you can't smoke pot in this state, or, whatever it is. You can't have the window tint on your car be that dark. Well, yeah, you can. Lots of people do. What they mean is, if you get caught by thugs of the state, they'll punish you. But notice they're not even describing the danger. They're not even thinking of the danger when they're all the way in statist mindset. They really are talking as if a human being is incapable of doing something contrary to the wishes of the masters, of the political parasites, the lawmakers. Think of the power that there is in that. Now, people don't usually think all that much about the words they use and what they're actually saying. But I don't think it's too overblown to point out that this is very much a symptom of mind control. Because if I decide to do something and somebody who lives in the area says, like, that's dangerous, bad things are going to happen if you do that, they'll describe the bad things. They won't say you can't do that. You can't walk down that alley. Looks like I can. Like, my feet work, and there's the alley. What do you mean I can't? You're not allowed to. I'm not allowed by whom? But so often people talk in those terms and think in those terms, which is way more important, when they're in the statist mindset. They really talk as if human beings can't even choose to do something. And it's actually, there's a massive amount of power in that. And I noticed this years ago, how funny it is, whether you're dealing with tax collectors or bureaucrats or cops or anybody who acts as a enforcer thug of the ruling class. It's like, you can't do that. Okay, or what? What? You're just not allowed to do that. Well, if I did it, then by definition, I was allowed to do it because it happened and I did it. Then what will happen? There's an or else. But most of the time, they don't have to mention the or else. They don't even have to mention the threat. If they just say, oh yeah, you're not allowed to do that. You can't do that here. People are so trained into it by school and usually by their parents and by the, all the authoritarian hierarchy examples they're exposed to on a regular basis, obviously government being the most glaring one. They think in terms of, oh, I can't do that. I can do that. And it was funny because a friend of mine who was passed on, Nathan Freeman, used to talk about when anybody says, wait, are we allowed to do that? He was like, ugh, my least favorite word, allowed. There can totally be situations in which you want to know the negative consequences that might happen. Like, you have the right to walk down that alley, but bad things might happen, so it's useful to know bad things might happen. And it's worth knowing, oh, if you do that thing over within this imaginary line instead of within that imaginary line, thugs with badges may come and beat you up and stick you in a cage for however many years, depending on what it is. So saying that there are negative consequences, there's adverse consequences to doing a certain thing, that's not the same as you can't do it. It's risky and something bad might happen. But the thought process that most people, and I've done this with cops and with zoning fascists and with tax collectors, it's like, oh, you can't do that. What if I do? You can't. What if I do? Obviously I can. What happens if I do? And whether it's a fine or you can't take that deduction or I can write it down and pretend to take, what will you do if I do? But you can even see in the underlings, they're not like these mastermind, they're not the slave smiths. So they're just passing on the mind control and the indoctrination in this weird slave speak. They're just passing that on to you so that when you ask, when they say, well, you can't do that here. It's like, yes, I can. Well, you're not allowed. Well, if I did it, then by definition, I was allowed because nobody stopped me. They all allowed me to do it. And then what? What will they do? And the or else what is something that the vast majority of people don't even think about, the brain doesn't even go that far because they're not thinking in terms of consequences like they do in like every other aspect of their life. Like, oh, we could go for a walk today. It might rain. Well, then you can't go for a walk. No, you can go for a walk and you might get rained on and get wet and you might get cold. Like, that's, people talk of consequences, but they don't talk as if something makes it not be an option. But when the bureaucrats and the cops and the tax collectors and all the other parasites talk that way, it's because they think that way too. Well, you can't do that. Well, yeah, I can. What happens if I don't? And to even ask them that, they're like, well, there's penalties. You can see it doesn't even compute because they don't even recognize just the literal reality. They expect you to feel incapable of doing it because they told you you can't or you're not allowed to. Because that's how they feel and that's how they view reality. And there's massive power in that, especially for people who don't think about this stuff and aren't aware of this stuff, which is most people. If all they have to say is, oh yeah, you can't do that in Pennsylvania, you can't, whatever the thing is, whatever the law is, whatever the jurisdiction is, most people most of the time, this is changing now, but most people most of the time will still go, oh, okay, then I won't because I can't. Instead of, well, what's the actual penalty? Because if people could even think to that step, first of all, they'd start recognizing the evil of statism because they're like, oh, so it's okay if I smoke weed over here, but if I do it here, men with guns might kick my door down and drag me away. Like, that's evil and insane. But most don't even think to the consequences. They just think you're not allowed to here. But if they actually know the or else, sometimes people would just go, oh, okay, I don't really care about that. Like, you're not allowed to do this. Well, what are you going to do to me if I get caught doing it? Well, you might have to pay a fine of $50 or something. It's like, okay, then I'll do it. Probably get away with it. And worst case scenario, you'll rob me of a little bit of money. But if people are judging their actions by, well, what's the negative consequence? Not is it moral, but just, what am I actually risking? If I go down that alley, I'm risking getting beat up by those people. If I go for a walk when it might rain, I risk getting wet on my walk. That's just reality, and if I know the possible consequences, I can decide inside my own head what I'm going to do. That's still me being in control. That's just me getting information about cause and effect and what might happen, and then I'm still in control of me. But the very language that statists use of you can't do that implies you're not in control of you. It's not that you shouldn't do that. It's not just there are negative consequences, it's you can't. Yes, I can. And to just watch their reaction to somebody who says, or else what? Like, what's going to happen? And even if both sides totally know what's going to happen, the statists get uncomfortable the closer it gets to the surface. And we cover that a lot in Candles in the Dark. Especially when it comes to the statism that the person is advocating, that you're talking to. Like, if they say, well, I think, cocaine should be illegal because it's dangerous. Okay, like, you shouldn't be allowed to do that. Well, what does that mean? People are still going to do that, which means they were allowed to. Well, it should be illegal. Okay, well, what do you want to have happen to somebody who gets caught doing that? Like, I agree it's not healthy and stuff, and I don't do that, and I wouldn't advise others to. But what are you personally advocating should be done to somebody who gets caught with cocaine? Well, there have to be punishments. As soon as they see the literal reality described of what it is that they're condoning, they get uncomfortable. Well, this is also true of cops and bureaucrats a lot of the time, just having to describe it out loud. Well, you can't do that. Well, what if I do? Well, it's against the law. Okay, well, what if I do? Well, you'll get in trouble. All right, that's about as vague as you could possibly. What kind of trouble? Will somebody step on my toe? Will somebody blow my head off with a shotgun? What are the actual consequences? Instead of talking as if I don't have the power to choose whether to do it or not, tell me what the actual consequences are, and then I'll decide whether I'm going to do it or not. But even thinking in those patterns, which is literally just facing reality and describing reality, is something that most cops and bureaucrats and tax collectors are uncomfortable with. Even to the point of like and you see this so often with, there's 8 million videos of people being stopped and like, show me your ID. Like, who the hell are you? And like, I'm just walking along here. You don't get to just demand that, you Nazi pig. And when people, it's like, I'm giving you a lawful order. First of all, they never even know their own stupid laws. Second of all, their laws are illegitimate anyway. But they talk as if you have to. It's like, no, I don't. And when somebody says, well, what will you do if I don't? Well, you have to. Are you going to take me captive? Are you going to arrest me for walking along here if I don't give you a little piece of plastic because you told me to? And sometimes the more fascist ones will just eagerly jump to, yeah, I'm going to arrest you and drag you away and blah, 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 blah. But a lot of times they don't even want to, even the ones who literally do it, even the ones who literally carry out the violence, they don't want to describe it that way. Well, you're required to blah, blah, blah. That's another way they say it. You're required to. Well, required by whom? What the hell are you talking about? I can decide not to. I can decide not to give you my ID. I can decide to run you over. I can decide to run away. I can decide to try to take a nap. Now, you're going to react to different things in different ways. If I decide to punch you out, that won't go well. There can be different consequences for my different choices, but don't talk as if I suddenly don't have the ability to choose. And that's the power of the language, and that's why they use it and why they're trained to use that terminology. Because it's like hypnotism almost. You are incapable of doing X because you're not allowed to do X. I am not allowed to do X. I can't do X. I am required to do Y. And it works. And it's not literally hypnotism, but it is absolutely literally mind control. In the way they talk and the way they expect you to listen and hear it. Now, like I said, the low-level people, they're not the ones who even understand this. They're just another layer of victims of mind control, doing what the slave smiths trained them to do. But it's so funny to watch, just well-intentioned people who believe in government and law. When you ask them and you try to get them to look at just describe the literal reality of what we're talking about. Don't say you can't do that here. Like, oh, you can't smoke pot in this state. I'm pretty sure a gazillion people smoke pot in whatever state you're talking about. I'm like one of the only ones who doesn't, as far as I can tell. But zillions of people do. So don't say you can't. People obviously do. And the funny thing is, they don't even use this for real crimes because the people who would actually they don't say you can't murder people. I've never heard anybody phrase it that way. Because the people who are willing to murder other people, the indoctrination isn't working on them. They're functioning like immoral sociopaths who they don't give a crap about the rules. It's only the well-intentioned people trying to be moral that this works on. Because the implication is obedience equals you're a good person. And the person running around murdering people and beating people up and stealing their stuff, their first priority is not being a good person. They've decided, for whatever reason, they don't give a crap about other people enough to refrain from, initiating violence against a whole bunch of people. So nobody says, hey, you're not allowed to murder people here. But why don't they say that? If they say oh, you're not allowed to have your window tint be that dark. You're not allowed to have that plant in this place. You're not allowed to possess the feather of a migratory bird. And I know of that one because my brother got stopped by ranger fascists. It was years ago. It's are you, because he just finds feather on the ground. Oh, it's cool. Well, it's migratory, so it's against federal law for you to pick that feather up? What the hell? And it really is. There's a federal law about that. But the way they talk of you're not allowed to, instead of Imagine how difficult it would be for the enforcers if they weren't brainwashed too, if they were just describing the reality. Hey, I notice you have a feather, and I'm going to threaten you with violence, and maybe I'll just give you a fine, which means I demand to see your ID, and I'll take you into custody. I will forcibly capture you if you don't give it to me. And then I'll give you a piece of paper that says you have to give us a bunch of money, and then we'll follow up with various escalating levels of threats and violence if you don't give us money because we found you holding a feather. Literally, that's a real example, and it really happened to my brother. And I think he didn't even know about the law at the time. He was like, what? Really? What are you talking about? You're not allowed to do that. And even in the mind of the enforcer, the "you're not allowed to" is just this reference to some vague superhuman thing called the law, so that the enforcer doesn't feel like they're actually doing anything. And like the comment I talked about to begin with, the cop who goes, oh, well, I don't have a choice. I have to do. No, you have a choice. You could turn around and walk away. You could do that. Now, might it endanger your job or this, that? Yeah, there may be consequences you don't like, but don't pretend that you're incapable of choosing. And don't pretend that I'm incapable of choosing. We're both capable of choosing. Now, there will be consequences one way or the other, depending on what we choose. And we may be immoral bastards, depending on what we choose. For example, if you threaten to steal money from somebody because they hold a feather, you're an immoral bastard. You're a thief. And you saying you're not allowed to do that. Well, since when? Like, you're the one not allowing me to by threatening violence against me because you saw me with a feather. And so the mentality and the indoctrination has to be applied to the enforcers as much to the victims. Because if the enforcers had to literally think about the reality of what they did and didn't have all that mushy euphemistic language to hide behind, most of them would feel crappy about themselves, as they should, because they're immoral bastards doing immoral things on a regular basis. So they have to be taught in terms of, well, and, you know, the old line of, well, I don't make the law, I just enforce it. So this thing called the law just floats down from on high, and then I have no choice. I have to use violence against everybody I meet to make them comply with some random thing that I don't even know where it came from. And half the time they don't even know the law either. An extra layer of stupidity to it. But there is so much just voodoo mind control in the language they use and in the enforcers and the victims. Keep it up. They keep up the facade that this isn't just a threat of violence, because every law is a threat of violence, and that's all it is. It's not that you can't do that. It's if we catch you doing that, we'll use violence against you. It's not you're not allowed to. It's if we catch you, we'll use violence against you. It's not you're required to do X, as if we catch you not doing that, we'll use violence against you. But to just describe it as a consequence of an action makes reality too real. And even most enforcers would go, I'm not going to do that. Like when I actually literally describe it, I sound like the bad guy. That's because you are the bad guy. Which is why they teach you to talk in these fluffy terms. And sadly, most of the victims also talk in those fluffy terms. And so a cop will pull somebody over and, oh, I saw you did blah, 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 and you turned over here, and it's like, oh, I didn't know I wasn't allowed to do that. You're conceding you being a robot without free will and without the ability to choose, instead of just going, okay, like, I didn't even know there was this particular stupid threat that if I do this harmless thing, some mindless dumbass like you is going to try to steal some of my money. So I wasn't even aware of the threat enough to maybe have it impact my choices. And like, well, I'm going to try to avoid the road pirates today, so maybe I won't do this thing or that thing because they'll complain about it. But so many people talk, they blame, as the victim, they blame the victim. Say, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't know I wasn't allowed to. Why the hell would you be sorry about that? And why are you apologizing to this brain-dead thug who's initiating violence against you for something that isn't immoral, didn't hurt anybody, didn't threaten anybody, and you didn't even know that there was an underlying threat of bad things happening to you if you get caught doing it. Why the hell would you feel any remorse for that? That's not doing something wrong. That's doing something that some psychotic parasites arbitrarily declared, we're going to hurt you if you do this. But people are all apologetic a lot of times when they talk to cops or tax collectors, like, oh, I thought I was allowed to deduct. I'm so sorry. You're being robbed. Don't apologize to the thief. And if people even if people went along to avoid punishment and stuff, if they would just speak reality as it is, it would make a massive difference. If they talk to tax collectors as if, yeah, because you have thugs with guns backing you up who can steal my house or steal my bank account or put me in a cage, I may go along with a certain amount for the same reason I might go along with an armed carjacker if he catches me off guard, or, mafia thugs. But I'm not going to pretend that that's okay, and I'm not going to talk as if you didn't have a choice whether to do this. You did, you chose evil. And I'm not going to talk as if I don't have a choice. I can choose to go along with it, or I can choose to resist. Now, you may inflict negative, horrible things on me if I try to not be robbed, but describing it in reality makes it clear that that makes you an evil shit. It doesn't make it a reason for me to apologize to the thief for what the thief is trying to do to me, and for the weird arbitrary rules that the thief is using to decide how much to try to steal from me. It's so weird to watch people's mindset be so mentally and psychologically subjugated that they speak the language of enslavement. Many years ago, there was a cool article named Slave Speak, and I forget the author. Way back then, I asked to be able to use the term and use it. Dang it, I forget his name. I suck at remembering names. But it was a really good article, and it went through a bunch of the ways in which just the terminology people use, not just the ruling class, but their victims, the terminology just assumes and implies legitimacy to the thuggery, and it implies an obligation on the part of the victims to comply and obey and allow themselves to be victimized. And the power that comes through that mangling and perversion of language is just huge. And Mr. Smith knows it, and he explained some of it to Johnson in the book. So I just thought I'd do a rant about that. So be on the lookout when you see people talking about cops and they talk about required to and allowed to, and you can't do this and you have to do that. See how often that shows up. And once you're intentionally trying to make yourself aware of it, you'll see it's just everywhere in all status discussions about everything, the way people talk. It's just amazing. They're literally helping to enslave themselves with every sentence they speak, instead of just describing the literal reality of, well, if I do A, they're going to do B. And without changing anything else, if people just described reality accurately, almost everybody, including most of the enforcers, would go, this is messed up. Like, this is not how it should be. They don't have the right to do this to us. Instead of, well, we have to do that and we can't not. So, yeah, it would be nice if people stopped assisting in their own enslavement. Someday we'll get there. Yeehaw! So that's enough of a rant about that. Yee.